Can you say something about the situation on gender identity in your country? Is there self-ID, etc.?
The answer to that question is yes. We are one of those countries which have self-ID. Before 2011 in Portugal, people had to go to court to change their name. And to do that, they would have to have a diagnosis from a team of experts and have surgery, and it might be a positive answer or not. And it generally took several years. And due to that, there was some lobbying from the LGBT organizations so that there would be a law allowing the process to be simpler. And so in 2011, we had our first gender identity law. And according to that law, it allowed for transsexuals to change the sex and registration just by asking for it and going to a registrar, but they still had to be diagnosed. And I'm using the word transsexuals because that was what people mentioned at the time. Nobody was talking about transgender. Okay, and then in 2018, we have our infamous self-ID law, which is called Gender Self-Determination Law. And it was also approved due to lobbying of the LGBT organizations here. Before our country, we had 5 countries already which had approved similar laws. Argentina, Ireland, Malta, Norway, and Belgium, I think. And in those countries, this law was approved a bit in a stealth manner. Okay, there was no wide societal discussion. There was only a TV program with a debate, but none of the impacts on women were discussed on that program. There were no feminist organizations on the hearings in Parliament when the law was being the bill was under discussion, and the arguments that were being used were kind of like the similar arguments we see now in Scotland and so on, where people mention best international practice and things like that. Like everybody was in agreement that this had to be done. So it was a question of being as good in terms of human rights as the other countries. So what did the law approve? It approved that if you were 18 years old, you could change your documentation without the need of any diagnosis, just if you wanted. And the original law also allowed people aged between 16 and 18 to do that. Okay, but the law was vetoed by the President of the Republic, saying that he was not comfortable with people underage being allowed to do that. So the law returned to Parliament, and then what happened was that they put that there has to be a report from a psychologist or a doctor to say that the person knows what he or she is doing, but there is no diagnosis of gender identity disorder. Plus, what is important regarding this law, not just that MPs ignored completely that approving such a law could lead to possible conflicts with women regarding single-sex spaces, etc. Nothing is mentioned, nothing in the law, and it's still not mentioned after the approval of the law, as I will say afterwards. But the MPs also voted something which is really problematic, which is that the gender identity ideology should be promoted. Okay, in fact, the law has an article, and on paragraph 1, it says, in regard to the education system, and I'm quoting now, "The state must guarantee the adoption of measures at all levels of education and study cycles which promote the exercise of the right to self-determination of gender identity and gender expression and the right to protection of sexual characteristics." Okay, so this was approved, as I said, on August 2019. So the government had to put out some measures to kind of like regulate how this would be done. And this was done in August of last year. And that's when people suddenly found out that this, what were the consequences of such a law. Okay, so the government put out the regulation of the law, and immediately it started to be a scandal because people start to mention what was going on in schools regarding bathrooms and changing rooms. This led to a petition which wanted the government to stop the regulation, which was signed for by 46,000 people. This led to the Secretary of Education have to be on the media, start defending the regulations and explaining that there wouldn't be unisex toilets, that there would be special toilets if needed for people with gender dysphoria. And another fact that was important regarding the gender identity law is that just before this regulation was made public by the government, a group of MPs, mostly from right-wing parties, submitted to the Constitutional Court a request for inspection of the law because they consider that it's against the Constitution, because our Constitution doesn't allow the intrusion of the state in political power in the programming of education and culture, according to any philosophical, aesthetic, political, ideological, and religious guidelines. And they consider that the law is doing that. So the law, so we're waiting for the decision of the Constitutional Court, whether the law is going to be vetoed or not. Another measure that was quite recent already in the last months was that the government changed, there was something like 200 euros that people had to pay to change the name, and now it's free. So that was just recently, I don't know, 2 months ago, something like that, that the government did that. I would like also to say something, which is that the government, it doesn't have to do with the government, it has to do with the demands that keep on going with the LGBT organizations, which are that the law should expand to people under 16, okay? And that all references to sex in documents here in Portugal should finish. And that were the demands last year of the Pride March here in Lisbon. The pressure is still ongoing also from that side.
Luckily, we still don't have the law on self-ID, but we are approaching that step. When we're speaking about Serbia, it's very conservative country, and we are still living in extremely patriarchal society. And I feel this is very important to stress, since the laws are not really reflecting the reality of the society. So we have the draft on gender identity law that still didn't enter assembly procedure. It was submitted by a Liberal Democratic Party, and it basically enables the self-identification. It was submitted in March 2019, but we had a very complex political situation, so it still didn't enter the assembly procedure. The law itself uses a very confusing terminology, from gender as a social construct and then gender identity as a feeling. So we have this kind of inconsistency in the law itself. And what it actually did, it addresses the issue by stating that there are people with gender dysmorphia and the treatment of gender dysmorphia. The treatment of gender dysmorphia was also regulated in the by public medical insurance law. And we have a procedure for quite some time about gender dysmorphia and the way you can change your sex. People change their sex. So the procedure was the following. There was a mandatory 2 years of psychiatric counseling, then 1 mandatory year of endocrinologist treatment, and then finally you needed to go through the surgery in order to change your sex. The new draft of law enables to not to have this medical procedure. Actually, how it's stated in the article is that if a person wants to treat the gender dysmorphia medically, it should be enabled, but if they don't want to, it's not mandatory. This is how it's defined. From the 1st of January 2019, there was a law on civil register. And the law on civil register, which includes all documents, actually enabled to change sex in your documents without going through a surgery. So we are basically left with 2 steps. First step is to have a mandatory psychiatric consulting, and the other step is to have endocrinologists. So in that sense, it's quite liberated, and it happened in a very short period of time. And the draft itself and the change of the register of the civil documents. So there was a lot of public cases that were used for lobbying, and I can say that they have already started to create the atmosphere where the law on gender identity is acceptable, although we are living in a society that we're living.
We don't have self-ID, and we don't have a law on legal sex change. The Supreme Court made a guideline for it on their own, and most judges follow this guideline when they give individuals permission to change their legal status of sex. The court usually require genital surgery and diagnosis from 1 doctor and 1 psychologist, and having had lived as the other sex for 2 years, and letters from their friends or family members supporting their transitions and so on. But it's just a guideline, not a law. So it's not legally required to meet all these requirements. So we have seen cases where judges allow people to change their legal sex status without genital surgery. And trans activists are focusing on pushing the passage of anti-discrimination law that includes the protection of gender identity alongside with sexual orientation. And most lefties and liberal feminists are supporting this act, but I doubt that this will be possible soon, because right-wing and Christians are very strongly opposing this law. And we are more concerned about the court changing requirement for legal sex change, because the criteria is getting loose. And this year we had several cases regarding gender identity that alarmed women. The first case was about a transgender soldier, a male staff sergeant age 22, he removed his testicle in Thailand last year, and after he came back to Korea, he was referred to the military panel to determine. They determine whether he can keep serving as a soldier. And the army decided to dismiss him on the ground that he is unfit to continue to serve due to the physical and mental disabilities. And in a press conference held by a gay advocate organization, he expressed his wish to keep serving as a female soldier. And then he is now in the court process in order to formally change his legal sex status. And he's saying he will sue the military for dismissing him. Encouraged by this and inspired by this case, a man applied to, last year, he applied to a women's university in Seoul after changing his legal sex status. And he got accepted, and he released to the press he's going to enter the women's university as a trans woman. And this case enraged South Korean women all over the country, especially female students in women's universities. 23 feminist groups in 6 women's universities released a statement opposing this man entering women's universities. And they also pointed out that legal sex change shouldn't be allowed. They gathered 10,000 signatures just in 4 hours online, and this made the news. Some female students even had interviews with news media exposing their face. And many women also called the university admission office and made complaints. So after this news, the man said that he withdrew his admission and decided not to enroll the women's university he got accepted, because he got quite scared watching fierce oppositions against his admission to the women's university. We are trying to raise awareness about this gender identity issue. Majority of female population here on our side, women usually don't think men should be allowed in women's spaces just because they had their genitals removed. The liberal feminists and leftists are all on trans activist side.